What happens when the very foundation of a family starts to crack? When the promises of love, equality, and spiritual unity begin to unravel? Can a marriage built on these ideals survive when emotional neglect creeps in? Favoritism takes over and trust is shattered. If you've been watching the Sister Weg, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Cody Brown, the patriarch of a Plural family, thought he could balance multiple marriages. But what he didn't account for was the emotional cost of keeping it all together. As Cody's emotional neglect became more apparent, the once unified family he built with his wives, Meri, Janelle, and Robyn, started to splinter apart. But it wasn't just his neglect that caused the breakdown. It was the emotional void he created by favoring one wife over the others, and the tension that followed. We saw Cody's relationship with his wives go from love and faith to resentment and hurt. The question is, what happens when those feelings get so deep that even the strongest bonds can't hold them together? In today's video, we're going to take a closer look at how Cody's emotional withdrawal and his favoritism towards Robyn caused a ripple effect that ultimately tore apart the Brown family. We'll examine the personal struggles of Meri, Janelle, and Robyn as they navigated the emotional chaos of a plural marriage, each trying to find their own truth, their own safety, and their own path to healing. Hey there, friends! I'm Mia, and welcome to TLC's next chapter. If you love diving into the behind-the-scenes drama of sister wives, then this is the place for you. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about Cody's actions? Was it all doomed from the start? Cody Brown's emotional neglect was more than just a passing issue. It was the slow-burning fuse that eventually led to the explosion of his family dynamics. For years, Cody managed his plural marriages under the guise of fairness and equal attention. But over time, his priorities began to shift. As he grew closer to Robyn, the newest wife, his emotional investment in his other wives, Meri, and Janelle, started to dwindle. It's clear that Cody's neglect wasn't a simple oversight. It was a pattern that formed over time, leading his first 3 wives to feel increasingly invisible. Cody, who was supposed to balance his emotional and physical needs across 4 women, started to focus almost entirely on Robyn. His favoritism towards her became undeniable. At family gatherings, he'd gravitate toward her, leaving the others to fend for themselves. For Meri, this was particularly painful. Meri, who had been with Cody the longest, found herself abandoned and ignored in ways that hurt deeper than the surface level. Neglect Meri's struggle became a symbol of the emotional void that grew within the family. She wasn't just neglected, she was left to carry the emotional weight of being the first wife who once shared Cody's heart, but now was left with a distant, distracted partner. Over time, her pain became more apparent, especially in the way she pulled back emotionally, trying to hold on to the pieces of the family that no longer felt whole. The truth was clear. Cody wasn't the same man he once was, and Meri was left alone in a relationship that had ceased to feel equal. She began to question everything from her own worth to the foundation of their marriage. Then came Robyn, the newest wife, the one who Cody claimed was his true love. From the moment she entered the picture, there was a subtle but noticeable shift in the family's emotional dynamic. Robyn wasn't just another wife, she was his priority. The woman Cody poured his emotional energy into, leaving the others to pick up the pieces. As Robyn became the focal point of Cody's attention, jealousy and resentment brewed within the other wives. It wasn't just about the unequal distribution of time or affection, it was the feeling of being replaced by a younger, fresher version of what Cody wanted. Cody's neglect of his other wives only grew as he became more emotionally invested in Robyn, and the cracks in the family foundation deepened. It's easy to see how this shift set the stage for a lot of the hurt and betrayal that would come next. Cody's actions weren't just selfish, they were toxic, creating a rift that would push Meri, and Janelle to confront the painful truth. The family they once had was no longer a team, but a broken collection of individuals with unmet needs. The betrayal within Cody's plural marriage wasn't just about him neglecting his wives. It was about the emotional fractures that started to develop between the wives themselves. The most painful and impactful moment came when Meri felt betrayed by and this moment encapsulated everything that had been brewing for years. Christine, the third wife, had always been someone who believed in the idea of sister wives. She once saw the family as a cohesive unit, But as Kody's emotional neglect deepened, her relationship with him started to fray, and her bond with Meri weakened too. The tipping point came when Christine made a decision that felt like an abandonment to Meri. She revealed her plans to leave Kody. To Meri, this was a blow, not just to their family structure, but to their very emotional connection. She felt betrayed by someone she had always trusted and supported. To Meri, Christine's decision wasn't just about leaving Kody. It was a symbolic rejection of their shared commitment to their family and the sister-wife bond they once had. This moment of betrayal shattered the fragile trust that had held the family together for so long. For Meri, it was a betrayal of the ideals they had once stood for as a plural family support, loyalty, and shared commitment. But for Christine, it was more about her own emotional survival and realizing that staying in a marriage where she wasn't emotionally fulfilled was no longer sustainable. This conflict, however, revealed the underlying problem in the family. The promises they had made to each other were being broken left and right. The rift between Meri and Christine wasn't an isolated incident. Over time, trust issues began to plague all the wives. The sisterhood they once shared became more of a performance, a facade they had to uphold for the sake of the family. As Robyn became more emotionally intertwined with Kody, it only exacerbated the tension. The emotional gaps between the wives deepened, and they were no longer just competing for Kody's attention. They were battling for their own emotional safety and dignity. Robyn's increasing closeness with Kody further alienated the other wives, creating more division. Rather than healing any of the emotional wounds, Robyn, once a new and exciting addition, had now become the cause of further emotional isolation within the family. The women weren't just fighting Kody anymore. They were fighting each other's shifting loyalties, and no one seemed to know where the lines of trust had gone. The emotional damage was far beyond what Kody had anticipated, and the fallout was already too great to mend. Polygamy, in its ideal form, was meant to create a sense of unity and support among the wives. But in reality, it only magnified the emotional toll it took on everyone involved. Instead of forging a bond between the wives, Kody's multiple relationships created an environment of emotional fatigue, competition, and an overwhelming imbalance. Each wife felt the strain of constantly vying for Kody's attention, affection, and emotional investment, but no one could ever seem to get the balance right. For Christine, the emotional exhaustion became unbearable. She had always prided herself on being an open, supportive, and dedicated member of the family, but as time went on, it became painfully clear that she wasn't receiving the same emotional investment that Robyn was getting. The shift in Kody's behavior, his increasing favoritism towards Robyn, left Christine feeling invisible and unimportant. It wasn't just about being the third wife anymore. It was about being emotionally sidelined. For years, she had invested so much into the family, only to realize that her emotional needs were no longer a priority to Kody. It wasn't about jealousy. It was about the recognition that her emotional well-being had been completely disregarded. This realization led to Christine's decision to prioritize herself. She finally understood that staying in a situation where she felt unseen and unsupported wasn't just unhealthy, it was unsustainable. The truth was, she was no longer willing to give more of herself when she wasn't getting the same in return. And for Christine, that was the breaking point. She couldn't stay in a marriage where her emotional needs were being ignored, no matter how much love she had for her children or commitment she felt to her family. Janelle, too, faced the strain of polygamy in her own way. Janelle had always been the more independent wife, often opting for a more hands-off approach to family life, but even she felt the weight of Kody's emotional withdrawal. She may not have expressed her dissatisfaction as dramatically as Christine, but she too felt the sting of emotional neglect. Janelle had long given up trying to engage with Kody on a deeper level, knowing full well that his emotional focus was divided, but over time, even her patience wore thin. She didn't feel like she was a priority to him anymore, and that sense of emotional disconnect slowly started to chip away at her resolve. It wasn't just about time or attention, it was about Kody's refusal to show up in a meaningful, supportive way for her. And in a polygamous marriage, when one wife feels neglected, it reverberates throughout the entire family dynamic. Meri's journey towards self-preservation was a difficult and emotional one. For years, she had tried to make her relationship with Kody work, holding on to the hope that things would get better. But over time, the emotional neglect became undeniable. The distance between her and Kody grew wider, and it wasn't just Kody's emotional withdrawal that took its toll. Meri found herself increasingly disconnected from her sister wives, especially as the tension between the women grew. It was one thing for Kody to favor Robyn, but it was another for Meri to feel that no one in the family was emotionally available for her. She had tried for so long to keep up the facade of unity of the strong, supportive sister-wife bond, but deep down, she knew she had been emotionally abandoned. Meri's turning point came when she realized that in order to protect her own emotional well-being, she needed to set boundaries. This wasn't easy for her, especially given her religious beliefs and the role she had long played in the family. But she could no longer ignore the emotional toll it was taking on her. She began to pull back, creating a distance between herself and Kody, and also between herself and some of the other wives. In doing so, Meri was finally asserting her own emotional needs. She realized that if she didn't, she would lose herself entirely in a marriage and family that no longer served her. Christine's decision to leave was perhaps the most significant and shocking of all. For years, she had clung to the idea of family, to the vows she had taken, and the promises of unity and spiritual fulfillment that polygamy had promised her. But the reality was far from what she had imagined. The emotional neglect she endured from Kody, combined with the growing fractures within the family, left her feeling unsafe, both emotionally and physically. As much as she had tried to push through, she realized that staying in the marriage would only continue to harm her. She had to prioritize her mental and emotional health, even if it meant breaking the vows she had made. It wasn't about abandoning her family, it was about choosing herself. For Christine, leaving was an act of self-preservation. The decision to walk away, while heartbreaking, was the clearest way for her to regain control of her own life and well-being. The tension between the family's religious beliefs and the harsh reality they faced became impossible to ignore as time went on. Plural marriage, as dictated by their faith, was meant to bring unity, emotional fulfillment, and spiritual growth. The idea was that each wife would be supported by Kody emotionally and spiritually, creating a bond of sisterhood, trust, and faith. But as we all saw unfold on screen, that was far from the reality of what happened in the Brown family. Kody's failure to meet his role as both the emotional and spiritual leader was a crucial part of the family's unraveling. Rather than fostering a sense of equality, unity, and balance, Kody's favoritism toward Robyn created an emotional rift. He became more and more emotionally unavailable to his first three wives, leaving them to fend for themselves in a relationship that was meant to be built on shared faith and commitment. His inability to maintain his promises to the wives left them questioning not only their marriage but also their beliefs. What was once a foundation of spiritual ideals was now crumbling under the weight of his neglect. In many ways, Kody became a symbol of how failing to meet the emotional needs of those closest to you can tear down everything you once held sacred. Christine's transformation after leaving Kody was nothing short of empowering. For years, she'd poured her heart into a relationship that left her feeling emotionally abandoned. But once she made the difficult decision to walk away from the polygamous family, something remarkable happened. She began to rediscover herself, no longer weighed down by the emotional exhaustion of trying to please Kody or keep up with the competition within the family. Christine found peace in her own life. She was finally free to pursue her own happiness, prioritize her children, and focus on her mental and emotional health. She spoke openly about how she had spent years feeling less than, and how leaving gave her the strength to reclaim her identity, something she had nearly forgotten in the suffocating environment of the plural marriage. In her own words, she admitted how much of her sense of self had been tied up in the idea of being a good wife, and how leaving Kody gave her the chance to finally feel like herself again. For Christine, the biggest revelation was how deeply she had lost touch with her own needs. The moment she stepped out of the marriage, she learned to embrace her individuality and independence. The weight lifted, and she was able to experience life outside the toxic cycle. Her relationship with herself became the cornerstone of her healing, proving that leaving wasn't a failure but a powerful act of self-love. For Meri and Janelle, their growth came more gradually, but was just as significant. Meri in particular had spent years trapped in a cycle of emotional neglect. Her failed catfishing scandal was a turning point that made her reevaluate everything. her marriage, her self-worth, and the toxic patterns she had been accepting. Though she didn't immediately leave the emotional distance she began to establish with Kody and her sister, wives signaled a major shift. She began to put herself first, something she hadn't done in years. Her social media posts started to reflect a stronger, more self-assured version of herself. She was no longer the neglected wife behind closed doors. She was reclaiming her power in front of the public eye. Janelle, on the other hand, took a more quiet but equally significant approach to self-preservation. She too had felt the sting of Kody's neglect, but approached it in her own way. As Kody emotionally withdrew from her, Janelle learned how to set her own boundaries and take control of her narrative. She became more vocal about her struggles and her journey towards self-discovery. It's clear now that Janelle, like Meri and Christine, found herself outside the marriage. Though her journey may have been slower, her growth was undeniable. Whether through speaking up more in family discussions or taking more time for herself, Janelle found a sense of independence she hadn't realized she could have. Together, these women, Christine, Meri, and Janelle, embodied what it meant to reclaim personal independence. They learned that in order to be healthy, happy, and whole, they first had to nurture themselves. They weren't just sister wives anymore. They were individuals with their own identities, goals, and lives outside of Kody's influence. Their journeys proved that sometimes walking away from a system that doesn't serve you isn't a sign of defeat, but an act of strength and self-respect. As the years passed, Kody's emotional withdrawal became more and more evident. At first, it was subtle. Small, gradual changes in his interactions with his wives. But over time, it became painfully clear Kody, once the central figure holding everything together, emotionally checked out. He began to prioritize his connection with Robyn, leaving the other wives, Meri, Christine, and Janelle, to fend for themselves. This wasn't just a failure in his role as a husband. It was a total breakdown of his responsibilities as the patriarch of the family. He stopped engaging in meaningful conversations with his wives, neglecting their emotional needs. His withdrawal wasn't just physical, it was deeply emotional. He was no longer interested in being the partner they needed. And worse, he didn't even seem to care. For Meri, this abandonment cut the deepest. She had already been emotionally isolated for years, but Kody's increasing neglect pushed her into a place where she felt entirely invisible. It was as if the love and connection she once believed in were nothing more than an illusion. Her struggle to be seen, heard, and valued within the marriage turned into a bitter reality. She had to accept that Kody would never be the emotionally present partner she had hoped for. It wasn't just about him focusing on Robyn anymore. It was about her realizing that her emotional needs were no longer even a priority. Christine, already facing her own challenges in the marriage, reached a breaking point. The emotional void left by Kody's withdrawal was too much for her to bear. After years of trying to make it work, she finally understood that her well-being could never be fully restored as long as she remained in a marriage where she was emotionally abandoned. Her decision to leave was a direct result of Kody's lack of engagement. He had distanced himself from her so completely that she couldn't ignore it any longer. For Janelle, the emotional strain became too much to bear. She too struggled with Kody's failure to engage with her and his inability to balance his relationships. Though she didn't leave immediately, the writing was on the wall. Janelle's emotional health deteriorated as the years wore on, and the reality of the family's collapse became clear to her as well. In the end, Kody's emotional withdrawal was the catalyst for the disintegration of the family. He failed to live up to his role as a husband and patriarch, leaving behind a trail of broken relationships. The bonds that were once formed through shared faith and commitment were now reduced to a hollow shell. The emotional damage was irreversible, and the family dynamic that had once seemed so strong came crashing down. As we reflect on the emotional unraveling of Cody Brown's family, it's clear that the central issue wasn't the number of wives or the structure of their marriage, but the emotional neglect that ran like a silent thread throughout Kody's failure to engage, emotionally proving that leaving wasn't a failure, but a powerful act of self-love. For Meri and Janelle, their growth came more gradually, but was just as significant. Meri in particular had spent years trapped in a cycle of emotional neglect. Her failed catfishing scandal was a turning point that made her reevaluate everything: her marriage, her self-worth, and the toxic patterns she had been accepting. Though she didn't immediately leave the emotional distance she began to establish with Kody and her sister wives, signaled a major shift. She began to put herself first, something she hadn't done in years. Her social media posts started to reflect a stronger, more self-assured version of herself. She was no longer the neglected wife behind closed doors. She was reclaiming her power in front of the public eye. Janelle, on the other hand, took a more quiet but equally significant approach to self-preservation. She too had felt the sting of Kody's neglect, but approached it in her own way. As Kody emotionally withdrew from her, Janelle learned how to set her own boundaries and take control of her narrative. She became more vocal about her struggles and her journey towards self-discovery. It's clear now that Janelle, like Meri and Christine, found herself outside the marriage. Though her journey may have been slower, her growth was undeniable. Whether through speaking up more in family discussions or taking more time for herself, Janelle found a sense of independence she hadn't realized she could have. Together, these women, Christine, Meri, and Janelle, embodied what it meant to reclaim personal independence. They learned that in order to be healthy, happy, and whole, they first had to nurture themselves. They weren't just sister wives anymore. They were individuals with their own identities, goals, and lives outside of Kody's influence. Their journeys proved that sometimes walking away from a system that doesn't serve you isn't a sign of defeat, but an act of strength and self-respect. As the years passed, Kody's emotional withdrawal became more and more evident. At first, it was subtle. Small, gradual changes in his interactions with his wives, but over time it became painfully clear Kody, once the central figure holding everything together, emotionally checked out. He began to prioritize his connection with Robyn, leaving the other wives, Meri, Christine, and Janelle, to fend for themselves. This wasn't just a failure in his role as a husband. It was a total breakdown of his responsibilities as the patriarch of the family. He stopped engaging in meaningful conversations with his wives, neglecting their emotional needs. His withdrawal wasn't just physical, it was deeply emotional. He was no longer interested in being the partner they needed. And worse, he didn't even seem to care. For Meri, this abandonment cut the deepest. She had already been emotionally isolated for years, but Kody's increasing neglect pushed her into a place where she felt entirely invisible. It was as if the love and connection she once believed in were nothing more than an illusion. Her struggle to be seen, heard, and valued within the marriage turned into a bitter reality.